Hi, friends. Thank you for tuning in to the Concussion Coach podcast. I'm Bethany Lewis, the Concussion Coach. I'm a neurological occupational therapist and certified life coach, and I specialize in guiding people through their concussion recovery journey. I am passionate about helping people understand their injury, speed up their recovery, and reclaim control over their life post-concussion. The purpose of this podcast is to help increase awareness of concussions and the impact they can have on a person's life, and to bring hope to people who have suffered a concussion and those who love them. I firmly believe that sharing stories and knowledge about concussions will bring important light and understanding to this misunderstood and often invisible injury. The information in this podcast is meant to bring that awareness and hope and is not meant as medical advice. The opinions shared are those of the interviewees and my own. If you are suffering with lingering concussion symptoms, I have created a concussion coaching program specifically for you. I will be your mentor to guide you through your recovery journey, offering help with understanding and managing your symptoms, setting achievable goals, and learning how to manage your own thoughts and nervous system in order to get control over your life again. If this program sounds like something that would help you or someone you love, sign up for a free consultation. In the consultation, you'll get valuable information and resources and gain hope for your future. Sign up for your free consultation at the link in the show notes or at my website, www.theconcussioncoach.com. Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Concussion Coach podcast. I am so happy today to welcome back my friend and mentor, Leah Davidson. Leah joined me back on episode 23 of this podcast to help discuss the nervous system and how it can be impacted by brain injury. It was an incredibly informative conversation, and I'd highly recommend going back and listening to it, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. Leah is a certified life coach, professional resilience coach, and consultant. She is also a registered speech-language pathologist and has spent over 2 decades working in the area of traumatic brain injury. She is also certified in pain reprocessing therapy, EFT, which is emotional freedom technique. Yeah. Breathwork and embodied processing. As the host of the Building Resilience podcast and the creator of the Advanced Training for Nervous System Resilience, Leah focuses on helping people learn to befriend their nervous system, manage their mindset, and cultivate resilience. She's also passionate about teaching others how to resolve and prevent burnout, stress, and compassion fatigue. Leah lives in Toronto, Ontario, Canada with her husband, Rob, and they have a blended family with 5 children. She loves to learn, grow, hike, read, travel, and spend time with friends and family. So thank you so much for being here, Leah. I've been looking forward to this conversation. And just for all you listening to know, we're going to be talking about pain today. And Leah has been focusing the recent episodes of her podcast on this topic. So you will definitely want to check out her Building Resilience podcast if you want to hear even more from her about this. And I will also link those episodes in the show notes of this too. So thanks for being here, Leah. I'm so excited.
Perfect. I'm so excited to be back. I love talking with you.
Yes, this is like one of my favorite things to talk to Leah about the brain and the nervous system, and
we just geek out on it. Yeah,
we do. It's so fun.
Basically, you're just recording a normal conversation that we would be having.
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly right. So welcome to being a fly on the wall, all of you listeners. This is how we roll. But I am excited to talk about pain today, particularly neuroplastic pain, since this is something that people with concussions often deal with on a regular basis. And I know that the research on pain in general and our understanding of it has increased so much in the past few years. It's absolutely fascinating. The ways that I was taught about pain in school are now known to not be necessarily entirely accurate. So let's start off by having you share with us some of what we know about pain now that is different than what the general understanding of it has been in the past. And yeah, let's just jump right in.
Jump right in. Yeah, because there has been a lot of new things, and I think there's still a lot coming. There's so much more that we know as we learn more and more about the brain. But there has been just a couple things that have really jumped out. And I think one of them to point out is there's a difference between acute pain and chronic pain. And so we're going to be focusing more on chronic pain. Now, acute pain obviously is pain that people feel, whereas chronic pain, also pain that people feel, but it is usually past the point of when we would expect the healing to have taken place. So we expect healing to happen between 3 to 6 months. Chronic pain extends beyond that. The other really cool thing about the difference between acute and chronic pain is they're in different areas of the brain. Acute pain, I think there's like 44 different areas of the brain that light up when there is pain. But when it becomes chronic pain, it actually moves location, and it goes to a location that is more in line with learning and memory. So that gives you a little bit of where our conversation is going, that pain actually can be learned, but it can also be unlearned. So some of the myths that they've really just busted about pain is that one, physical pain is not always due to physical damage. And two, the body can experience pain even in the absence of that physical damage. Well, I guess that's the same one, essentially, that there's physical pain there even without damage. But two is structural abnormalities don't always cause pain. So those are sort of the two things that I think many people go in thinking that if I have physical pain, it must be because there's physical damage. And you can actually have something wrong, structural abnormality, and it does not cause pain. And that they did a lot of work on. There's a lot of work that they've done with back pain, where they've seen that it's actually normal for people to have disc herniations and bulges after a certain age as we get older. But many people have them and don't experience pain. Whereas it's quite common that if somebody comes in with back pain and they find something on the MRI, they'll attribute that pain to that scan. Whereas the research has shown many people have those scans and don't have pain. So what's the difference? So I think those are some of the big things that have come up in recent years, that pain needs to be looked at differently, and it needs to be evaluated differently, and it needs to be treated differently.
Yes, thank you for sharing all of that. And I think something else that I've learned more recently about pain is that, and kind of goes along with this, but that the structural, like pain in an extremity you don't feel it in the extremity. Like it's not because it's right. You feel it in the brain. It's a brain thing.
That's right. It's a brain thing. Yeah. Well, because what happens is that the brain is the one that creates the feeling of pain. So what happens is they talk about three components of that whole cycle of pain. So there is, like, say you touch something, then there's the sensory receptors. The nerves send pain signals from the body to the brain. Actually, it comes to the spinal cord and then sends it up to the brain. Then the brain interprets those signals and then sends a message back. And depending on how the brain interprets it is whether or not you're going to be feeling pain or not feeling pain.
Yes.
And the best example for that I will give you, I think I shared with it on my own podcast, but years ago at the beginning of my career as a speech pathologist, I was working on a floor in the hospital, walking on my way to the nursing station, and there was this gentleman who was like crying out in pain, like yelling in pain. And he saw me pass by and he was like, come in, come help me. And of course, new SLP, not that I would know what to do with this, but I went in. He was like, the nurses have abandoned me. They've left me. I'm in so much pain. Please go get somebody. So of course I was like, oh my gosh, this poor man is in desperate pain. He said his legs. And so I went to the nursing station and I just found one of the nurses and I said, Mr. So-and-so in this room is in desperate need. He's pain, his legs, like what's going on? And she said to me, like, how much time did you spend with him? Did you talk to him? Did you see him? I was like, no. And she said, well, come back with me. And so we went back into the room. And when we went in the room, she, in a very nice way, showed me he had no legs. His legs had been amputated. His pain was through the roof, but it was all phantom pain. And that was my first introduction years ago, that pain happens in the brain. So even though there was no limbs there, he was still experiencing the pain.
Yes.
And then there's that other famous study that I think I shared in the advanced training about the nail. So a construction worker had gotten, I think he fell and landed on a nail, and the nail went through his boot, through his foot, and like obviously writhing in pain. It was horrible. They took him to the hospital, and then when they were there, they had to remove the boot. They did what they had to do, and he was like screaming. They gave him, all the pain medication. And what they actually found is the nail hadn't even broken skin. It had gone right through between his toes. But his brain had registered that it was through his foot, and it was a source of tremendous pain, and that's what caused the pain. So the brain is the creator of the pain, regardless of the type of pain, acute or chronic. All pain is created in the brain.
Yes, thank you. And I think something else kind of along those lines is those quote unquote pain receptors are called nociceptors. Yeah. And I was taught that they were pain receptors, and like from what I remember being taught, it was like that senses pain and it sends it up to the brain to let you know that you're in pain. But really, those are threat receptors. It's like, okay, something has happened. You need to be aware of it. And then the brain determines, based on the context, based on everything else, whether that is something that should feel pain or not. And so I just think that is so fascinating because Dr. Eric Cobb he does Z Health. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. Yeah. Super fascinating. I listened to him talk about pain as well. And he shares about, if you're walking and you trip or whatever, and you sprain your ankle, you're going to usually feel a lot of pain and be limping. And like automatically that's going to be the response that your brain and body produce. But if you're, crossing a street and you twist your ankle and there's a car coming, your brain assesses the situation and you will be able to get across that street before you start feeling pain. It's going to create that for you to protect you. So it's a protective mechanism. And
it's letting you know there's danger. There's a really great TED Talk. I'm not sure if you've seen it, with Lorimer Moseley, who is one of the pioneer pain researchers. And he does this amazing, it's very comical as well, where he does talk about sort of like the same triggers in one environment. The brain is also assessing, what does it know about the past? Mm-hmm. And so he had given an example where at one point, he was a little kid walking through the bush. I think he's Australian, walking through the bush and, being twigs. And it was like no big deal. And so one day walking through the bush, twigs, no big deal. But what had ended up happening is he was bitten by a venomous snake and he almost died. And so they were able to save him. But then years later, walking through the bush, feel a twig, it was like tremendous pain, because basically what had happened was the brain had learned that's dangerous and we better check this out. And it actually took him, even though everything was fine, it took him a couple of weeks to come down from the pain, because his brain was so protective and there was so much fear associated. And when we combine fear with sensations, we get a lot of pain. So it's worth checking out that TED Talk, because he does a fantastic job. It's really humorous too.
That's awesome. Thank you.
It just shows exactly what we're talking about.
Thank you. I love that. And that actually brought up a couple of thoughts in my mind. Like, the super interesting that not only was his nervous system aroused and he was like on high alert, but he actually felt pain, physical pain from it. That is super, super interesting. And that fear sensation cycle reminds me, we talked before when we had our last conversation about like birth and that process. But one of the things that I learned through hypnobirthing was that fear tension cycle. Like if you're afraid of it, it creates that tension in your body, which creates more pain, which is like just kind of feeds itself. Right. So there's so much to this. And
there's so much to that. And even when you said like that fear pain cycle, often I'll be working with clients and they'll say something like, well, I don't fear my pain. But when we use fear, I'm like, we can just replace it with danger. Your brain thinks it's dangerous. And what does the brain code as dangerous? Well, anything that's frustrating, anything that I'm resistant to, anything that causes me anxiety, anything that causes me overwhelm. All those things essentially get coded the same way. So we say like fearing it, but it could just, are you frustrated that you have pain? Are you desperately trying to fix the pain? Do you have like despair because you have the pain? All those things, the brain literally reads as danger, and it keeps that cycle going.
Oh, that's such a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think too, something that can play into it as well is that the cognitive fear piece of like, if we believe that the pain means that something is wrong in our body, like in our extremities, that something is damaged. And people talk to me a lot, like, I'm afraid that I'm going to make it worse or I'm going to damage myself more. And so like that fear can also play.
Fear. Yeah.
So super interesting background to all of this. So tell us, what is neuroplastic pain or mind-body syndrome? Tell us about all of this.
So neuroplastic pain is basically the idea that the pain is being created in the brain. Maybe you have had a symptom in the past related to an injury, but the injury has healed. Or maybe there's like a perceived injury. And this can happen, like maybe you've just been on a long car ride or sitting for a long time and you get up and you're like, oh, my back, what's going on? There's a perceived, because I've been sitting for so long, that must be what it is. But pain can also be a result of stress in our lives. Maybe there's a stressful time, a stressful event, or there could be this really slow accumulation of stress, which is really actually a very common reason why people get pain. And that's how the nervous system gets involved. Like over time, if we spend so much time on high alert or in a dysregulated state, our body can't sustain that. We start using all our systems to the point of being almost abusive to them. And eventually what happens is they do shut down and they will create symptoms. So a lot of the symptoms that we start to feel is basically the brain's way of saying, hey, something's going on here. You got to pay attention and you've got to change some things in your life. So when you have what we call these mind body, they're often illnesses or pain that we experience that are being brought on and sustained by our fear, by our lifestyle choices, by, past traumas. These are things that are keeping us in this dysregulated state and just keeping the symptoms going.
Yes. And that is such an interesting, I don't know, is the brain is trying to protect us. I think that's an important point to make too, is like the brain is sending these pain signals because it's trying to use it as a behavior modification strategy. So
that's right.
You're doing this thing and it's not working for us. And so I'm going to give you pain so that you will change your behaviors.
You'll change what you do. Yeah. And that's why you can start to see it sometimes what is labeled as mind body can be very surprising for people. There are some things that, Dr. Howard Schubiner, he's one of the leaders and pioneers in the US with mind body syndrome. And that's his term that he uses. But he said there are some things that are clearly mind body, like tension headaches, irritable bowel syndrome. A lot of the head, neck, and back pain are clearly mind body related. He has like a whole list of them. And I know often these are things that we don't associate with mind body. We're like, no, I have a proper diagnosis, which we're not saying that you can't have a diagnosis, but people sometimes are kind of resistant. Like, no, I have a proper diagnosis. I have something that's really wrong with me. And mind body, we're not saying that there's nothing really wrong with you, but we are saying that are we going to look at the body for a structural reason, or is it the brain that has either relearned or overlearned or still learning, and that there's something we can do to change it? And he uses the example, like if you break your wrist is going to be fractured and broken, regardless of the temperature outside, regardless of whether you're going through a stressful time, regardless of the time of day. Whereas for many of the other things that are mind body, they will fluctuate. Different times of day, they get amplified. Anything that gets amplified when you're stressed out, you know that there's going to be a component of mind body in there. Anything that changes, like changes location, well, it was on one side, now it's on the other side. There's a whole bunch of things that we can look at that will indicate to us that it's mind body.
Yes, thank you. And I want to go into that. But before we jump into that, I do have like a question and a statement to make really fast. So I think the point that you were making before is important, that, people say, I have this diagnosis. This is real. And it is real. Like the pain that you're experiencing is real. And I think that's really important to throw out there. Like, even though we're saying it's in your brain, it's in your head, quote unquote, that doesn't mean that it's not real, that you're not feeling it, that it's not significant thing.
But all pain is created in the brain, regardless of where the pain is. It's all created in the brain. But I think sometimes we feel better if there's like a structural thing and the brain is picking up on the pain from something that's structural. Yeah. We feel validated when there is a diagnosis or there's something structural. And I think that's really like society, we've done that, right? We feel validated if there's a proper diagnosis. And then if there's not a diagnosis, it really leaves people to think like, well, something must be going on with me. Well,
Yeah.
something is going on. It is very real. We believe you. We don't need to have that diagnosis for you to, really have real pain.
Yes, it was so well said. Thank you. And I am curious for just a second to touch back on something. You used an example way earlier on, like if you're driving in the car for a really long time, you get out and your back is hurting. Is that my brain is like, well, that's structural. Like you've been sitting for a long time. Is that not how it is? Like, tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, it definitely can be. And then you get up and then you just move around and shake it off. But have you ever had one of those things where you just, this has happened to me so many times. I'll wake up in the morning and I'll have like a neck kink and I'll just be like, oh, I must have slept really wrong. I've had a hard time, but it stays for weeks. Like I have this neck sore. And then I realize, oh, it's tied to a very stressful time in my life. So sometimes we can do things like twist the wrong way or move the wrong way. It should heal. It should take care of itself. Yeah. So after, if you stretch it out after a long trip, it should give it some time and go away. But if you find that it's not going away, or, like, I don't know, it just started this way. I've had this upper back pain and neck pain. I just woke up one morning and must have turned the wrong way. We'll create all these stories. But if we start tracing it back, we can start to see sometimes like what was going on in your life when these symptoms came up and why are they being sustained for so long?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And it makes sense too that physical things that we do can impact it. It can exacerbate it or make it feel a little bit better. But if we notice that it's more of a chronic, like a long-term thing that isn't resolving when the structural issues might have been resolved, then that's.
Yeah. I mean, acute pain and acute things, we want to take care of them. Like we want to make sure that there is nothing wrong. I would never say to somebody like, oh, just blow it off. And it's just, I think I've given this example in the group before that my husband had a massive heart attack years ago. And I was, all the symptoms, I was like, oh, it's anxiety. He felt it in his back and we had been skiing and he'd been doing the moguls. And I'm like, he was 42 at the time. You're not so young. You probably just, pulled something. You got to take it easy. Well, that was fine. And that could have been the reason, but we always want to make sure we go and check things out. So I would never say to somebody, you get the pain and then just always assume it's mind body. No, the first thing you do is you have to rule out, is there something going on here that needs medical attention right away? And that's always going to be the first place to start.
Yes. And I think that is a really important thing to put out there at the beginning here too, is I just recently, within the last week, I think I've spoken to two people who had a stroke. Like one was a subdural hemorrhage and the other one, so it was like a slow build kind of thing. And then the other one had a more intense stroke. But both of them were like, I just thought I was having a really bad migraine. For one of them, it was like days worth of a migraine. And get it checked out because there can be things we're not saying that physical structural damage doesn't happen and that doesn't need to be addressed.
That's right. Yeah.
It's very, very.
We know like tension and migraines is often mind body, but it can also be symptomatic of something like really big. Yeah. So, I mean, and definitely, obviously, everything we say here, you have to go talk to your medical practitioner. I would just be open to the idea that some medical practitioners are more in sync with what's going on in the new neuroscience of pain. But you do want to make sure you get things checked out, that there's nothing structural. Is there anything medical that can be done? But if that's sort of in the all clear, and the symptoms are still persisting, then you may want to be open to the idea of it's mind body, or there's at least a big element of mind body of something that you can do differently to take care of it.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And I think we're kind of already touching on some of these, but do you want to just kind of lay it out a little bit more clearly, the fit criteria that Dr. Schubiner talks about? Yeah.
So Dr. Schubiner, what I love is he says it's sort of like different steps of how do you determine if it's mind body. And the first thing is you have to go rule out, like we've been saying, rule out that there's something structural, rule out that there's, like cancer, tumor, heart attack, like you have to be ruling those things out. If after you've ruled those things out, then you come back and he talks about something called the fit criteria. And that's functional, inconsistent, and triggered. And so functional basically means that a lot of the symptoms you're having don't fit or they're not explainable by structural conditions. So for example, you start having a symptom out of the blue. It occurred without any real injury. Like I said, I woke up in the morning and I had a neck sore. Yeah, I could probably say maybe I slept weird on my pillow, but it's not going to usually keep keep being sustained pain for a period of time,
Mhm.
or it has persisted after any injury would have healed. And that's where he gives that criteria. He's like, we know injuries heal between 3 and 6 months. Another way that it could be functional is it kind of spreads to different areas of the body. So it started on one side and then it moved over to another side. Like he's like, structural things don't work that way.
Mm.
The second thing is inconsistent. And it means like the symptoms will vary in ways that structural conditions would not. So the symptoms would shift. They're more or less intense at different times of the day. Maybe they'll disappear for a period of time. Maybe they're worse with like certain clothing or certain shoes. Like this chair is okay, but that chair is not okay. Or they occur when you think about them, or they occur or intensify with stress. And that is a biggie because I know that that is one where, there's a lot of symptoms that can get worse with stress, which just tells you there's a mind-body component to it if they get amplified with stress. And then thirdly is that they're triggered, that the symptoms are brought on by a certain stimuli, which actually would not cause the symptoms physically, but they activate the brain to generate the symptoms. So he talks about like symptoms are being triggered by maybe certain smells or certain sounds or light or food or changes in weather or specific movements, or triggered by the anticipation of stress, or triggered by even imagining you doing something in a triggering activity, or even just triggered by like a really light touch. So that's his criteria, that you rule out the structural, and then you rule in mind body by looking at the fit criteria.
Okay. So functional, intermittent. What was the second?
Inconsistent.
Inconsistent and
Yeah.
triggered. Okay. Thank you. And I had a question as you're talking about that. It brought up things, there are a lot of things that can be amplified by stress. And when we talk about the symptoms increasing, we're generally talking about that pain response, right? The pain that you're experiencing. But there are things like, you mentioned IBS, like irritable bowel syndrome, where it's not just like, I have pain in my stomach, but the actual stool changes. Like it creates more than just, it creates what feels like structural, like physical changes.
For sure. It's very real. Like I suffered from IBS. So, if anyone were to tell me there's no physical symptoms of IBS, I'm like, you are very wrong. There are very physical symptoms, but the symptoms they're usually inconsistent. They're usually triggered by something, and they're functional because also we look and we see that there's nothing structural. Like most people who are diagnosed with IBS have been through all the testing to see, okay, there's nothing structurally wrong. And sometimes that comes across as there's nothing wrong with you. Like we can't find anything. I remember I was diagnosed 30 years ago. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just IBS, which of course made you feel terrible. I'm like, oh my gosh, it is all in my head. Now I have the understanding what they're saying is structurally there's nothing wrong. But yes, there are changes. We also, there's some genetics that are associated. People tend to have symptoms or pain in places that maybe, their parents had it. Like if your parents suffered from migraines, you might suffer. Your parent had IBS, you might have IBS. So there's all things like that too. So it's not just pain, it's also the symptoms that can come up, and they are amplified with stress. Yeah. And often most people can admit that yes, stress amplifies certain symptoms, but then to say that stress is the cause of, so many other things, they'll be like, no, that's impossible. There's no way that stress can cause that. Stress can do crazy things to your body because it impacts your nervous system. And your nervous system is in charge of everything. And when it is on overdrive for years and years and years at a time, it is impacting every single system in you. Yes. So it makes sense that it could show up in the weirdest ways.
Yes. Well, and on that kind of like, I remember talking to one of my fellow OTs at Cognitive Effects recently, and she said one of the most surprising symptoms that she would never have associated with concussion before was digestive issues, because it's exactly that. It's the underlying nervous system gets dysregulated and it controls everything. And so digestive issues can happen. Like there's just so many things.
Yeah.
impacted
Well,
by
you
it.
look at like post-concussive, like digestive issues, and then things like anxiety and insomnia. And then often, I mean, how many times do you have people? I mean, this has been my experience that they'll develop pain well into their injury.
Yeah.
And they may say, well, it's because I had this concussion. But that pain didn't show up at the beginning. The pain is only showing up later on, which so much of it is that factor of the constant dysregulation that they're in, that now all of a sudden other problems are going to be coming up because you're in this constant dysregulation. The body just can't take being in that state for good. It's not meant to be in that state for good.
Yeah. Yes. And this is like a perfect segue into talking about concussions and head injuries and how this kind of plays into that. But I still have a couple really quick
That's
points
okay.
from what we were talking about before. Because again, still on that IBS thing, I'm just curious because we talk about, the stress impacts it and can do that, but there are certain foods that can impact it as well, right? So that it feels, and maybe, I don't know, is it the fact that it's mind body or neuroplastic pain,
Neuroplastic.
like, is that just one factor to a diagnosis that is ongoing, or is it like all that and everything is impacted because of that?
Well, it's interesting. And I think this is where the jury's still out because people will say different things. I know that Dr. Schubiner, he's like, food does not trigger IBS. And when I heard that several years ago, I was like, what? No, that's not true. Like, I can give you a list of foods that trigger my symptoms. And then I started thinking about it. This list of food, am I then approaching that food with this idea of fear and this idea of like, oh no, what's in that sauce? What's in that thing? What's the ingredient? What's this? What's that? And as I started realizing that, I started to believing more and more that it's not necessarily, and I started testing things out. And I started the foods that for years I was like, can't eat that, can't eat that. And I started playing around and changing things. And when I lowered my guard and wasn't so hyper vigilant about what are the ingredients in that, what are the ingredients, I actually started to be able to eat those foods without the symptoms. So he says it's not food related. I was like, it totally is. But my own little experiment, I'm like, okay, maybe there's sensitivities, but I'm amplifying the sensitivities by my fear towards them and by my hypervigilance with them.
Right. That makes sense. But you must have come up with that list for a reason, right? Like there was something that at some point you'd had those and had maybe it wasn't directly related to that, but you associated with it. But there are
But there's
people
so many things that could have been associated with. I mean, I do think that there's certain sensitivities. There's probably certain allergies that maybe I had. But then there was also like stressful times in my life, what was being associated with what. I also remember, and when he said that, I was like, oh yeah, because he said some people will also have remedies that they're positive will help them. And I had, when I was first diagnosed, this is like I said, going back 30 years, I saw finally a naturopathic doctor because everyone else was telling me there's nothing, it's all in your head. And I'm like, no, clearly there's a problem. I was really sick. It was debilitating. Like I had to like curb what I was doing in my life because I didn't want to go out. I didn't want to go anywhere. So I met this doctor and she said to me, here's a secret. It's linseed. And you get linseed, so flaxseed, and you soak it in water for 12 hours and then you strain it. And as you strain it, there's like this slime that comes out of it. In boiling water, you heat it up and you drink that and it coats your entire intestine and you won't have symptoms. I started doing that all the time and it helped tremendously. But what would happen if I didn't have it, no hot water was available, I was like a mess because I'm like, oh no, I don't have my secret remedy. And, was it placebo? I'm sure there were some benefits to it, but it was really placebo. And then it was also nocebo when I didn't have it. I used to be like panicking. The most important thing was, could I have my hot water and linseed slime? Because that really helps. So there's a lot that our brain can play around with.
Yeah. Oh, it is just so interesting. So fascinating to think about all these things. And again, there are like legitimate allergies that like your body can have a physical reaction to things. So like an IBS, I think has cleared most of those out too. It's like there's not like a specific.
Well, you always have to rule out we can't emphasize that enough. Rule out. It's really when you're stuck with people can't find something, there's nothing wrong. The challenge with that is most people just keep going on a hunt to get that diagnosis without, I'm going to find it. I'm going to find it. And then of course it gets reinforced because sometimes people do find something that was, missed or all along. But I'd say that I think they're saying statistically, the majority of people with chronic pain and chronic illness, it does fall under the category of mind body.
Super interesting. And I think there are some other, I remember you mentioning a few other diagnoses that typically could be, they're the ones like IBS that it's an umbrella term for the things that we don't understand or like we don't have a structural reason for it. So like fibromyalgia, POTS, some other things that are like, this is, and again, it's not to say that it's not real, that your pain isn't real, it's just that there's a much more mind component of it.
Tinnitus, vertigo, that's something else that I struggle with, vertigo. And I really thought I have a hearing loss. And somebody had told me once that it is, this is going to be a consequence of this vertigo, that I would get these bouts of vertigo. And then I went somewhere else and the doctor was like, no, vertigo wouldn't be caused by what you have. And I'm like, really? And so then again, I was like, oh, I got to test the whole mind body thing. And so now when it comes up, I'm testing it and I'm seeing how it's very related to stress in my life. It's very related to the fear around something and it gets amplified. But again, rule things out and then rule things in.
And I think it's an important point to make too, that even if you rule it in and the fact, like, even if it is quote unquote in your head, like this is it's happening due to stress or due to other things, that doesn't mean that you're at fault or you're causing it, or there's like zero of that. It's actually good news because you don't have to go through 6 months or like 6 to 8 weeks or however long it takes to have a structural thing get fixed. Like there are things that you can do to help calm that system, to help move forward. And like you said, the IBS stuff, you've come to a place where you're pretty good with it, right? Like where would you say you're at with it now?
Yeah, totally. And that's why I wanted to bring up, like for me, it came out like IBS and vertigo. And then I definitely get tension headaches. And so I want to put that out there. Like there's no shame or there's no blame. The majority of us will have mind body. Now they do have some connection if you've had, a lot of trauma in your life, that they seem to have a higher incidence of it, but just everyday people will have it. And that's why I want to share that. I'm teaching this, I'm sharing this with people, and I'll openly be like, oh yeah, I get those symptoms too. And I have to, because I'm human, I'm normal. My nervous system gets dysregulated. And so it is good news though, because you can start playing with it. You can start, oh, is it possible? Like, could it be this? And not just dismissing like, no, that's, what are they saying? It's in my head. Like, just play with it. Is it possible that this symptom is mind body? Because that would be great if it is, because now I can learn different ways. And it's not going to be perfect at the beginning. I'm still figuring it out. Like I still have to go through and, okay, what works? What doesn't work? I still get bouts of IBS flaring up at certain times. I still get bouts of vertigo at certain times. But instead of like freaking out like I used to, I sort of go more, okay, well, what's going on? What's going on in my life right now? What is my body trying to tell me? Does it need this? Does it need this? What is the kindest thing that I can do for myself right now? And generally, it's not freaking out.
I love that. And I think that's such a really important point, that just knowing this information can, if you're not, don't use it to beat yourself up, just use it as oh, this is good information. Now I can it gives hope for there's possibilities here. And what if, and exactly what you said, like allowing it to be taking care of yourself rather than beating yourself up or getting so scared. Oh no, this is the end. I'm going to be out for weeks from this or whatever. Right. Rather than having that fear tension thing increase the symptom, you can approach it and know what, build your toolkit of what works for you.
Right.
And just that.
And not being married to whatever diagnosis or label that has been given to you or that you give it. Be open to the idea that you are you and you are experiencing certain symptoms, because I think so many people take the diagnosis and it becomes like a badge. It's an identity.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to shake. And I know that that can be a tricky conversation with people, because they're like, you think I want this? You think I'm like, no, I don't think you want this. But I think your brain, and it has become such a part of you, that we need to try to detach you from the diagnosis, or detach you from whatever it is that's causing the symptoms, so that you can start seeing it from a little bit of more objective, and start witnessing the symptoms, instead of it being like, I am just this person who is racked with pain or symptoms all the time, because then it does become part of your identity.
Yeah, it becomes who you are instead of separate from you. I think that's such a good point. And this is maybe ridiculous, but I was just talking to my siblings the other day, two of my sisters-in-law, and one of my brothers, he might be mad at me for sharing this, but I won't tell you which brother. I have five. So one of my brothers, when he was in college, got lice from being in college, right? It happens. But I was like helping him. He was at my house. I was helping him get rid of it. And he was just like so grossed out by it. He was like, I am disgusting. I was like, you're not disgusting. You have a thing that is like happening to you right now. Like, this is a thing that is separate from you as a person. But he like internalized it. And then my other sister-in-law was like, oh, my husband would have totally done that too. So apparently a couple of my brothers would have that tendency to like take it on and become that, instead of like, no, like I am a perfectly whole, perfect person here, like living life. And dealing with this thing and like being able to separate it. So again, that's like a very physical thing versus, like lice versus a diagnosis.
We see it with like even the language that we use. And I do think that's why we have to be careful with the language. You'll hear people refer to others, or refer to themselves as, I'm brain injured. As opposed to, I'm a person who has a brain injury, and it's such a small thing, it may seem, but it makes a difference. One of them is like an entire identity, versus the other one is, I am still me and I have a brain injury, or I have this symptom, or I'm struggling with this. It doesn't have to come on and take over, even though I know the challenges a brain injury kind of permeates your entire life, but it still doesn't take over who you are as a core.
Yeah, I think that is really important. And the point that you made too earlier about a lot of times this can be impacted by early trauma and stuff. And like, again, that's just a reason to have all the self-compassion and grace, and not like, it's not your fault. Like, it's a thing that has happened and now we're like working through it, but it doesn't mean anything about you as a person or your value or worth. So I think that's just an important point to make.
Exactly.
And I appreciate that you're very trauma informed. You have a lot of information about that. And so it can be, it's hope. I don't know. I feel like I want to get the message out that there's hope. Like, even if you've had trauma in your past, even if you're dealing with these things that feel completely out of your control, there is control. And that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. And that's why you have it. It just means that there's hope for improvement here. So
that's right. Yeah. Moving forward. Yeah. That's the saying, you're not responsible for what happened to you in the past, but you are responsible for what you do moving forward. And I think that's, many of us have experienced trauma, all different kinds of trauma, whether it be like, however you want to classify trauma. Many people have all of us have experienced it on some level. But what will you do with it moving forward? That really is where all your power lies. Will you be able to, move forward, finding the support that you need, getting the right tools and the education, being open-minded? Or are you going to be forever married to that past with trauma, and that becomes like the definition of who you are?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think along those lines too, it's like you pointed out with the nervous system, when it's highly aroused, or like in that super hyper aroused or the hypo aroused states, it can feel like you lose access to that agency, that ability to choose how you're going forward. So again, have all the grace and compassion for yourself. Like, it did impact you, and it is like, it's a thing, but like, let's exactly what you said. Let's be open.
And that's why you do need to learn about your nervous system regulation, because when you are activated, hyper or hypo, you do lose access to your agency. You lose access to your choice because you're really losing access primarily to your thinking skills, your executive function skills. In order to get those skills online, you have to be sort of at a baseline of some type of regulation. And I think that's why, like, everything does start with learning about your nervous system and regulating. You know, if we look at like, what is the treatment? Because I'm sure that's going to be one of your questions moving forward. Well, the treatment, it needs to start with learning about your nervous system, befriending it, meaning like no judgment or shame, just where am I at? Am I dysregulated most of the time, whether it's hyper or hypo? Building up, like, what does it mean for me to feel calm and safe? And many people don't have that experience. Like, they've never experienced that. So finding ways to start slowly introducing safety in their lives, building that up, and then you'll be able to move from hyper or hypo into what we call sort of your safe home state. So it really does start with learning about your nervous system and befriending it.
Yeah, so important. Thank you. And we will definitely jump more into that in a little bit. But let's talk about now. We'll go back. Sorry.
Back up.
To brain injury specific. I know, yeah, I've had clients with so many different types of pain following concussion. That it can be neck injuries and like neck pain, headaches of all sorts and sizes, pain in different parts of the body, facial nerve pain. I had 2 clients today who were telling me that just thinking hurts, like thinking things today, like, is really painful. And so what have you seen in your years of working with people with traumatic brain injury when it comes to pain? And what are your thoughts on it?
The first thing I'll say is it's definitely a very sensitive topic. And I think part of it is how people have talked about pain. And when people hear neuroplastic pain, they think that what people are telling them is it's not real. So I think hopefully we've dispelled that. We believe it's real. So there's really a lack of neuroplastic pain. And I guess what is tricky with brain injury is when we talk about ruling in and ruling out, there are a lot of different severities of injury. And there's a lot of areas that we can see on MRI have been damaged, but with, concussion, often we don't see if there's any damage. So many people have very clean MRIs and they still are suffering from the symptoms. I know, like, I had reached out to Dr. Schubiner because I was working with a small group and we were talking about mind body. And I had just said to him, like, what are your thoughts on post-concussive symptoms? And he said to me that he believes that most post-concussive symptoms are mind-body, because just as all injuries heal, the brain heals too. In fact, the brain is very neuroplastic. And so he said, we know that it can learn new skills, overcome even things like the injuries, but it can also get stuck in habitual patterns of pain, of brain fog, of fatigue, of memory loss, which are really all the symptoms of post-concussive. And then I think you and I have talked before. There's a book called Run Towards the Danger by Sarah Polley. And she talks about having a concussion. It's sort of later on in the book, one of the last chapters. And she meets a doctor in the US, I have to say US since I'm from Canada, but he meets a doctor in the US, Dr. Mickey Collins. And he is a clinical neuropsychologist and the executive director of the UPMC Sports Medicine Concussion Program in Pittsburgh. And his protocols are also very similar to those used with mind body. So he's another one that has been doing a lot of the research in looking at mind body. So I think there's a lot to consider. I think that it is interesting if your clients are willing to explore mind body, because I've seen that when I've explored mind body with my clients, they have all benefited. So whether we're able to remove all the symptoms, or whether we're able to sort of turn down the volume on a bunch of symptoms, I do think that it is beneficial. I will say one thing that I mentioned to you earlier, just sitting here listening to me talk to you on a podcast, like, I don't know your audience. They don't know me. Probably they don't know you either. And so it can look like, who are these women just tossing? They don't know what my pain is like. They don't know. I'm not going to try this. I'm not going to trust this. But I know that the clients that I work with, and likely the clients that you work with, we've worked with them for a while. We've established a trusting relationship. I hope that they know and they feel seen and heard and validated. I believe the symptoms and the pain they're experiencing. And once we sort of can confirm that, then they usually are more open to, well, let's try this. Let's try some of these strategies and tactics and tools and see what happens. And when we've done that, the majority of the clients that I work with, not all of them, there are some that I think are very married to their symptoms that they have, but the majority of them do see gains. But it also, you have to have like the right timing, and you have to have the trust in the relationship for some people to be willing to try it. Some will just jump in after this podcast, be great. Yeah, sure, I'll try it, anything.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, they want and need that validation, and then they'll be open to trying different things.
Yeah, I think that is an important point to make. And I think too, I know with the cognitive FX where I work, they like one of the kind of core understandings that we have is that there are like the brain is neuroplastic. And that's part of what happens with the post-concussion syndrome is your brain has developed these other ways of accomplishing the tasks that it needed to do and couldn't because the pathways were interrupted. But those other ways were less efficient and problematic. And so like there are things that can be done to like heal those underlying concerns. But I do 100% believe that that emotional component, like there's so much that plays in through that mind body part that impacts it as well. So I think with post concussion, there's both going on.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think so too. That's why I was like, it's sort of, it's sensitive because there's a lot to consider when somebody has a brain injury. It's very complex. Like there's a lot going on. And it also, like you said, how long have they been creating new patterns? How long since their injury? There's so many different things to consider. This can be one of the things that you also consider.
Yeah, 100%. So tell us more. When you say you work with your clients and they're open to trying things, what is it that you're trying? What can people do about this pain if it is neuroplastic and based, the mind body kind of pain?
So almost every single client that I work with, we first talk all about the nervous system, learning how to regulate, learning how to identify when you are on sort of that hyper state versus that hypo state, learning what are some triggers for you, as we talked about the triggering, sort of learning about that. The next thing that we do is, so after they've learned about their nervous system and they get a bunch of tools to help them, a lot of breathing and a lot of just relaxing their body. The next thing we do is we try to kind of rule in, are there mind body components? And we look for, we talk about being a detective for searching for times that they fit criteria, like searching for times where, oh yeah, that is weird, that it's inconsistent, that it only happened this day or that day. And so starting to play around to build up proof and evidence that there are times when they don't necessarily have the pain. And so they can start believing more and more that there is a way for them to control that volume dial, so to speak, the amplification of symptoms or the decrease of symptoms. So we look at that. The next point really is looking at how can you interrupt the pattern that the brain has created. Because usually what happens is maybe you'll start feeling a symptom. And like I remember, even just if using my example of IBS, I know it's not brain injury, but it's all the same thing in terms of what we do from this place forward. I'd feel like a cramp in my stomach, and that would send off like a cascade of, oh no, yes, what's going to happen? I'm not going to do this. I need to find a bathroom, or I would just really, and then my anxiety would go up and I'd start to feel trapped, and that made it even worse. And it could get to the point of actual panic. So I think it's interrupting it, that when I started to notice like, oh, okay, there's a cramp. All right, it's okay. There's lots of things. I'm just going to breathe right now. I'm going to relax my body. I can always, find a bathroom. There's this over that. So instead of confronting the symptoms with this panic, I'm confronting them with like a softness and a curiosity. I say to my clients, when you come to a symptom that you have, are you quickly wrapping the symptom in danger, or are you quickly wrapping the symptom in safety? And by danger, it means like this panic. Oh no, I'm going to have this headache for days. I'm going to have to cancel this trip. I'm not going to be able to sit through this concert. I'm going to be, my head's going to hurt after I do this interview. All these things is like, essentially, you're just like danger, 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 versus interrupting it. There's a symptom. Okay, there's a symptom. I'm going to remind myself I'm totally safe. There's no need to panic. What is something that I can do in this moment that allows me to feel better? And I teach people to do what we call somatic tracking. And this is where you basically you explore whatever symptom that you have in a very curious way. You're sending a message to the brain that I can experience this sensation. I can experience this symptom without it being attached to panic. I can just experience this symptom and just describe it. Is there a color? Is there a shape? And I can send it messages of safety. And so that interrupts the pattern of the brain of that pain, fear cycle that we talked about earlier that just keeps going and amplifies. It basically is like, I have pain. Oh, I do something different. I wrap it in safety and see what happens. Now, initially, I may still have the pain. I may still have the challenges. I'm not saying it's going to go away. In fact, we don't want to put the pressure to force it to go away because that just sends more messages of danger.
Yes.
But what we're trying to do is we're just trying to respond differently. That's how we start breaking the pattern, having a different response when we are confronted with a symptom.
Oh my gosh. I love everything you just said. And I I had so many thoughts coming through my mind as you were saying that. So I think, like you were saying, that when we can bring it to, rather than quickly wrapping it in danger, like trying to wrap it in safety. I like that analogy. And I think one of the things that people tend to do is their brain goes to, oh no, I won't be able to do this. I won't be able to sit through this interview or this concert or whatever. But then it goes to the future. I'm never going to be able to do this. And like, what does this mean for the rest of my life? And then that just conflates everything. And it just is like builds on itself.
And that's normal, right? Like we want to, in the sense, like people catastrophize, but you want to notice that's what you're doing.
Yes.
Because even though a lot of people, it's normal to catastrophize to a certain extent, but it's not helpful, which means that you want to try to interrupt that.
Yes. And being aware of it, aware that you're doing that. And then I like that you were, bringing it to this moment. I think that's that mindfulness piece of like, okay, we're not worrying about the future. We're not worrying about the rest of our lives right now. We're not even worrying about tomorrow. We're worrying about like right now, and I love that question. What can I do in this moment to feel better? And that question forces, like, it directs your brain to focus on something specific. I actually had a conversation with somebody today, and she was saying that she had gotten locked out of the house that she was staying at by accident. And she was like, had this time, and her thought was like, what can I do to make this moment better? And I was like, that is so brilliant. Like, it's so good. Like, what can we do in this moment to make things feel better or do better or like make this situation better somehow? So I love that. Like, not worrying about the future. Let's bring it to this moment. Ask ourselves, what can I do in this moment? And then I love that concept of being curious and like experiencing this sensation without attaching meaning to it. Without saying, oh, because I'm having this is what it necessarily means. This is what it means for my future. This is what it means about me as a person. Like all of that, we can separate that. Like so important. I love that. Interrupting that pattern. Okay. Which again, kind of ties into that. There is a pattern to it. And that's part of how we know this is mind body. And it's that associated with those learning and memory parts of our brain. It's just super, super interesting. Okay. So we interrupt it. Sorry.
We interrupt the pattern. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Anything else that like next steps for that?
I think the other thing that happens is when we interrupt the pattern, and this will happen with a lot of clients, they'll come back and say, okay, I did what you said I did and it didn't work. And part of it is we have to be what we call outcome independent, which means that when we put so much emphasis on giving, the task of you have to get rid of the pain, we're actually sending the pain more messages of danger. So when we approach things with such an intensity, the brain interprets that as dangerous. And so it's much more likely to hang on to it. So really the outcome independent is this idea of, I'm going to do this, interrupt the pattern, whether or not it helps my pain or not. Because my goal is not to get rid of the pain or the symptoms. My goal is to get rid of the fear of the pain or the symptoms, or the fear or the frustration or the despair, whatever, as we said earlier. So the goal becomes to reduce that fear. And that is much more, I think it's much more motivating and much more sustainable when we can be going after the fear, but still doing it like in more of a relaxed way, which is really hard because I think a lot of people, what they found with mind body is there's a lot of sort of personality things that can get wrapped into it as well. People have perfectionist tendencies. People have like a really strong inner critic. They put a lot of pressure on themselves, who worry a lot or who are very hypervigilant. These are people who may tend to have more mind body. Not always, but this is sort of the pattern when you put a lot of pressure on yourself. And what can happen is we end up putting the same pressure and intensity on fixing the problem and finding the solution that probably got us there to start with. So we're trying to solve the problem with the characteristics that caused the problem, so to speak. Not cause, that's a bad way to put it, that sort of perpetuated the problem.
That was my next question. I remember you mentioning personality types that tend to fall into this. And I think, I have a few people that I work with in mind that is, and it's served, you've made this point too, that it served them well in other aspects of their life. Like this is it's a great quality to have, to be very, I don't know that perfectionistic necessarily is like a great quality, but that drive to do very well, to push yourself, all of those things it can be very important and very helpful, but it doesn't necessarily help in this setting.
I say that to my clients. Often I work with very high functioning people, and often they had very quote unquote successful lives previously. And usually at some point, I'm going to be saying to them, what got you the success in your life pre-injury is not going to be the same toolkit that will give you what you need to be doing while you're in rehab recovering. It's a whole different set of tools and then sometimes, in fact, some of the tools that brought you the success are going to create the opposite challenge. Like when people are problem solvers and I'll fix it and I'll figure it out, that intensity can actually create more dysregulation and push you further into dealing with the symptoms.
Yeah, which feels, I can just see that being so hard for people who are like, this is how I operate. This is how I function in the world. And it is a lot of letting go and that approaching it with softness, like you said, it feels unnatural maybe, or just really challenging. But I've also talked to people who do this and they're like, I'm learning this skill of letting go. I'm learning to accept things. And that is a hugely valuable skill to gain as well. So it's sometimes we get forced into developing new skills that we didn't necessarily want. Right. As you're talking too, I just, an analogy that I like to use with people, and this, I don't know, I just see how this ties into, it's very similar to a lot of the emotional stuff that we work on. I love using the analogy of a beach ball. If our emotions are, we have a negative emotion that we don't want to be dealing with. Maybe it's kind of similar with these symptoms, rather than seeing it as something that's dangerous, if it's a beach ball and we're trying to push it under the water, no, I'm not going to deal with you. I don't have time for this right now. A lot of resistance. We just know that, the further down we push it, the harder it's going to come up when it does pop up and hit us in the face. And it takes both hands and all of our concentration and effort, to keep it away. If we let it be there and like you said, if the goal isn't to make it go away, if the goal is just to not be afraid of it and let it hang out on the waves next to us, then it takes away what we resist persists, right? It will eventually kind of go away, and it may come back, but that's okay. It's not, the fact that it comes back doesn't have to mean that we have to stress or like put all of our attention and energy into it again. Like, yeah.
And a lot of mind body has been linked to, repressed, suppressed emotions, that there is a big emotional component, that the more we try to keep down those emotions and push down, you can imagine all the effort and the tension in keeping those emotions pushed down, that sometimes this is what they say, they show up. Your emotions need to be processed. They need to be let out. And if you don't do it in a healthy way, a natural way, it will show up in your body, and then your body will force you to deal with it. So that is one of the main theories behind why people struggle so much with, the chronic pain and chronic illness, is there's definitely a component of this emotional, you got to get it out, or your body is going to force you to deal with it.
Yeah. And I like to the point that you make about when we get it out, it's not, we're not acting out on it. We're not like throwing a fit or like doing something drastic, but it's going into the body and feeling it, breathing into it, relaxing into it. And that's how we process emotions. Because it is happening in our body. We're feeling that. And so, yeah, I think that's important and helpful.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how can someone who loves and wants to support someone dealing with this kind of pain help them? Like, it's hard on everybody. Like, is there any suggestions that you have for the caregivers, the loved ones?
Yeah, I think it's really hard because, like we said, regardless of the source of the pain, it's very real and it hurts and it's hard. It's hard for everybody. So I think compassion is very, very key. But I also think we have to be careful not to try to force people to deal with things at our speed, our way, or the way we think. And I think sometimes caregivers, it can be frustrating for them too, because they may think, well, if you just did this and if you just did this, we're all sort of doing it on our own pace. That's why I'm saying, even as a therapist, I am careful when I do introduce things, because I want to be introducing them to my clients, knowing that like they're loved and they're supported and, validating them. But I do think that here's a way. If you're a loved one, though, I think sometimes your role is just to be that loved one, just to be that support that they can go to. You can maybe give them options if they want to try techniques, but I find that a lot of people will only try these things once they are ready. And sometimes that means they have to hit a certain level of desperation kind of thing. So people need to be allowed to make their own choices and respect that they may not be ready to try out different ways. But I do think it's also important that we spread the word, that we share. There are options that are available when and if you're ready to try them. And, for loved ones, I think that's all they can really do is be that support.
That's very important. I love that point of just like letting people be where they're at. And no, that's really good. Do you have resources or like where would you point people if they wanted to learn more about neuroplastic pain, or if they're trying to understand more about this?
Dr. Schubiner has an amazing website called Unlearn Your Pain, and he has so many resources. He has like a YouTube series all about pain, what it is, like these little short cartoon descriptions. He has lots of video links. He's been on many, many podcasts. So I would definitely check out his website. As I said, Lorimer Moseley, also, he does a lot of work. He's got that really fun TED Talk. And then there's an app called Curable, which is an amazing resource. And it has so many resources. And I think a lot of people have found that. And then lastly, Alan Gordon, he wrote a book. It's a couple years out now. It's in pain reprocessing therapy. That's what I was certified in. And it's called The Way Out. And while it sort of gears itself more towards back pain, it is completely relevant to all mind body, very relevant to a lot of the symptoms. And it's recently been getting a lot more attention in the public, in media, as being a new treatment that has had a lot of success with helping people with mind body. So that's a great place to check out as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'll link all of these in the show notes so people can look at those, but that's very helpful to have more information, like places people can go. And how about if people want to hear more from you, how can they find you? What is your offering?
You can find me. I am on Instagram at Leah Davidson Life Coaching. I also have my podcast, Building Resilience, which I talk about pain. I'm actually going to be doing a few. I've done a couple episodes. I've got a couple more episodes coming up, really doing a deeper dive on pain. I also, if you really want to take a deep dive in your nervous system, I do an advanced training in nervous system resilience. And as I just shared with you, I'm going to be starting in April. I have a new offering that will be coming out. So stay tuned for more details. But if you're following me on Instagram or listening to the podcast, you'll hear about it. Because to me, the foundation of everything is learning, befriending your nervous system. It's all about nervous system resilience. And if we can be focusing on that, I think we'll see huge changes with pain, with relationships, with your own inner peace and joy and confidence. It really is such a great foundation to be building from.
It really, really is. And I will put in like a personal testimonial and plug for your program. I was in your first cohort, and it was so good. And it really has changed the way that I don't know, it's been very impactful for me personally and in my family relationships, and especially in this work that I do with clients. It really is life-changing. So I would, and I love what you said too about the fact that it's the first step in dealing with this kind of pain is understanding the nervous system and how it's contributing to everything. So really, really such valuable information. Like, Leah's a wealth of knowledge and good stuff. So check her out, people. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I have learned a lot and am excited to, practice these things on my own. Like, I don't know, there's just so much goodness here to learn from and practice ourselves. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you listened in today. I hope you have gained some helpful insights and inspiration regarding dealing with and recovering from concussions. My goal is to create more awareness and education about concussions and the fact that there is so much that can be done to improve life after someone has had one. Help me spread the message by liking, commenting, rating, and subscribing to this podcast, and share it with others who would benefit from hearing it. There are more resources available on my website. And again, if you or someone you love would benefit from concussion coaching, sign up for a free consultation using the link in the show notes or at my website, www.theconcussioncoach.com. Thank you. See you next time, and take good care of that amazing brain of yours.